My presentation today is a chapter of a book project I'm currently working on, which focuses on the territorial ramifications of processes of technological change in the mining industry, but more in Latin America and Chile more specifically. But more relevantly, I want to use this presentation as an sort of an entry point to think about what a theory of planetary urbanization from the standpoint of labor would look like. I mean, if a theory of planetary urbanization starts from labor understood not only as a human productive practice, like in a particular sense, but in a more general sense as the sociometabolic process through which the material conditions of existence are produced and reproduced. Okay, so to begin with, the so-called commodity supercycle has been one of the most wide-ranging and persistent commodity booms in modern history. But very little is known about the actual technological revolution that has underpinned this commodity boom. This figure shows the world exports of mining and construction machinery, which skyrocketed, as you see, after 2001. So this indicates more than a mere shift in the intensity and scale of mineral production. And it actually points towards one of the most fundamental world historical transformations of our time. That is the staggering acceleration of automation and the computerization of the labor process that has been brought about by a whole leap forward in the productive technology of capitalism. And as you can see, this has been really strongly manifested in the mining industry. So I won't get into the details of how this new technological configuration has revolutionized the mining industry, but I will focus on some key technological breakthroughs. So first of all, geospatial information systems have allowed geologists and engineers to develop very accurate representations of the subsurface. And this has allowed the mining industry to mine low-grade deposits which were inaccessible or non-economical in previous stages of capitalist development, right? Second, innovations in robotics and control systems have allowed mining companies to introduce automation throughout various phases of the productive process. And traceability and systems analysis have also allowed the mining industry to develop an integrated approach to the production, to the whole supply chain. So the mining industry has become functionally integrated not only within the various stages of the extraction process, from forecasting to haulage to blasting to transport and to processing, but also has allowed the mining industry to become more integrated with the port industry and with the shipping industry as a whole. Okay, so according to Neil Smith, with the development of industrial technologies for capitalist production, the material unity between human and non-human natures becomes reproduced in ever more advanced configurations. So to begin with, the production of nature needs to be also understood as the production of the human, of the laborer. And the seizure and appropriation of the collective powers unleashed by human cooperation is transhistorical. And actually the notion of the mega machine of Lewis Mumford points towards how archetypal principles of automation, such as scientific calculation, compulsive regularity, the measurement of movement, were already being applied to the organization of human exertion centuries before the first industrial revolution. However, it is in the onset of with the arrival of mechanized industry that the harnessing of the drives for cooperation that are immanent to the human species reach a new synthesis. And the socio-technical arrangement that emerges, Marx refers to it as the collective laborer. So the collective laborer is the productive power that emerges from the collective organization between different human laborers or groups of human laborers. So Moïse Postone revisits this idea of the collective laborer as an industrial organism, and he argues that it is a polarizing organism which is underpinned by the uneven distribution of productive attributes between different organs. And we will see how this plays out within technological modernization in the mining industry. So for Postone, the increasing productive power of the collective laborer as a working whole is constituted at the expense of the individual, right? And it is not consciously regulated by any of the organs. but it becomes a form of existence of capital, right? So in the mining supply chain, this is clearly evinced in how there's been a threefold qualitative differentiation in the collective labor of the supply chain. So first, one of the organs has been contingent of the expansion of the productive attributes of those workers that are in charge of the more complex part of the labor process. So geologists, scientists, engineers now operate a very sophisticated technological equipment at the mining industry, and the spatial manifestation of this modality of the commodification of labor power has been a simultaneous process of the modernization of the infrastructural basis of cities, right? As studies in the global city have illustrated, like many urban hubs in Latin America have become specialized in attracting those most highly skilled organs of the collective labor of primary commodity production, whether like it's energy production or agro-industrial companies or mining companies, right? So there's been a whole, like tropes of competitiveness and modernization and making cities more attractive for these highly skilled workers have been unleashed throughout Latin American cities. At the subnational scale, there's also been a whole, agenda on modernization to make these cities more attractive. And the more highly skilled the worker of the mining industry is, the farther away the worker tends to live from the extraction site, right? So the more highly, in the case of Chile, for example, the more highly skilled of the workers of the mining companies live in Santiago, right, and commute to the extraction sites. However, and for reasons of its own self-preservation, capital cannot transform all workers into scientists, and neither it can transform all production into automation. So if we look closer to the organizational shifts in the mining industry, we will see very interesting patterns emerging. So first, alongside the capitalization of the mining industry, there's been a whole growth of a contractor industry, very similar to what's happened in the electronic industry. So major, large contractors have emerged, providing all sorts of sophisticated to low qualified services. And as you can see, engineering and consultancy, which are the highly skilled tasks, are the smaller are the smaller percentage of the services provided to the mining companies. Whereas support services, the lower skilled, are the largest percentage. So, as I was mentioning, the technical organizational dynamics in the mining industry have begun to resemble the sort of modular or turnkey modes of labor organization pioneered in the electronics industry. This means large contractors operating alongside the main, like the brand name firms. So as you can see in Chile, for example, major transnational corporations now operate as contractors of the mining industry, and they have broken free from captive positions within the supply chain. So mining companies see them as strategic partners rather than contractors proper. Of course, the largest contractors are the smallest percentage, and those are the ones that supply the most qualified services, skills, and equipment. For the most captive actors within the supply chain, the tendency has been one of de-skilling and casualization and degradation of living labor. And as you can see, the amount of subcontracted workers in the mining industry has increased dramatically as the mining industry becomes more capital intensive, more smart, more flexible, and more autonomous, right? So a second organ of this collective labor has consisted on the creation of this temporary, precarious workforce and informal workforce, informally known as faeneros, which work 7x7 shifts in mining towns. They usually don't tend to live in the mining towns, but they commute for very broad periods. And the result, like the spatial manifestation of this modality of the commodification of labor power, has been very polluted and very fractured towns that are called sacrifice zones in Chile and in other parts of Latin America, zonas de sacrificio. And because these commuting workers have no attachments to the host town, many social ills that were unknown for the local communities before the mining boom started to become prevalent, such as street fights, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. They usually tend to stay in overcrowded accommodations and in campsites. So this is a breeding ground for a whole of social problems. As a third organ of the mining supply chain has consisted in the production of a relative surplus population, which acts as the labor reserve army of the mining industry. And in general terms, it has been argued that the relative surplus population is a byproduct of processes of the concentration of social wealth in modern society. But it is a byproduct, but this doesn't mean it is an externality. It is actually internal to the very dynamics of capital accumulation in two ways. It provides like two key tasks for capital accumulation. On the one hand, the relative surplus population provides a constant supply of labor power, often at a price below its cost of reproduction. And second, it also acts as a demographic mechanism to discipline labor and to press down wages. Because who would unionize if you would have, there are like hundreds, if not thousands, of people who would do the same work as you, but for a fraction of your salary, right? So in the Latin American case, the production of this relative surplus population has been huge and has reverberated in the staggering and the startling growth of shanty towns and many forms of precarious settlements that has characterized the neoliberal period. When looked at the world historical implications of this has been so dramatic that Eric Hobsbawm argued that no event of the 20th century could be compared to what he termed the twilight of the peasantry. I mean, not even the rise and fall of state socialism, the IT revolution, or two massive world wars could even begin to compare to the systematic assault on agrarian and rural modes of existence that began to take place after the mid-20th century. Okay, so in the geographies of extraction of Latin America, this has materialized in the form of like a radical expansion of precarious settlements of various types, depending on the country, depending on the region, and depending on the form of primary commodity production, whether it's agriculture, mining, or any other forms of primary commodity production. So in these mining towns, displaced peasantries are drawn by the lure of the mining industry, of the high salaries paid by the mining industry, but usually swell the ranks of informal economies because the mining industry, as we saw, it's very concentrated and tends to operate with highly skilled personnel. This has created new racialized subjects because they tend to migrate to other towns, and this creates tensions with the local community. So new forms of racism have emerged in these mining towns. As you can see, for example, in the case of Antofagasta, the number of families living in these precarious settlements has skyrocketed. Antofagasta is one of the largest mining towns in Chile, in northern Chile. And as you can see, it went from 632 to 6,200 people living in these precarious settlements. As we all know, nature is intrinsically recalcitrant, so it systematically won't do what is told. And so the expansion of these technological systems, of these territorial infrastructures for resource extraction has also created very vibrant forms of social mobilization and social struggle. So historians of technology have repeatedly argued how the same determinations that revolutionize instruments of production also tend to revolutionize the material powers of the individual qua-productive subject. So we've seen new forms, new very exciting forms of labor organization amongst these precarious, these informal workers on the one hand, but also amongst the people who are not directly involved in the mining industry, but have been affected by these territorial infrastructures, such as indigenous communities, peasant communities, have become very vibrant oppositional forces. Not only oppositional, but they have also have been developing very vibrant alternatives to the current extractive model, right? Okay, so to conclude, basically, this study of the territorial and organizational transformation of the mining industry, one of the main conclusions of it is that, like the commodity supercycle, this extractive boom inserts itself within a new phase of world accumulation, whose determination is the production of relative surplus value at the world scale and the fragmentation of the productive subjectivity of the international working class. Why is this conclusion important? Because when resource booms have been traditionally considered to be the outcome of relations of unequal exchange or dependency between an imperial power, usually a European imperial power, and a dependent periphery. But with processes of industrial upgrading and technological change taking place in the global south, and especially in East Asian economies, the very metageographical concept of core and periphery and global south and global north have been profoundly destabilized, right? Second, the foundations for the uneven geographies of capitalist urbanization are to be found in the life of the collective laborer as a socio-natural system, right? We need to look at the shifting modes of existence of the global working class with respect to the productive attributes that each of its members embody, right? So for example, if we look at one of the archetypal works of urban studies, which is, like Frederick Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England, it was, by looking at, the processes of commodification of labor power taking place in 19th century Manchester, that was what led Engels to decipher the emerging forms of capitalist urbanization taking place as a result of the Industrial Revolution, right? So if we look at the various processes of the commodification of labor power, we can draw important conclusions about the capitalist production of space in 21st century society. However, if we set out from the standpoint of labor, this demands, of course, doing away with Eurocentric and teleological readings of history. As we all know, salaried, steady work, properly industrial work is, like a small percentage of the whole geographical and material configuration of the international working class. So we need to rethink the notion of the international working class to also include the various, precarious, outsourced, 0 hours workers who work on very different tasks. And finally, the mode of universality assembled by capital elucidates a rich specificity in terms of a vast multitude of concrete labors. So on the one hand, there's been this universalizing force that has created sheer geographical and ethnocultural fragmentation, as we've seen through the case of the mining industry. So according to Moish Postone, this contradictory tendency between sheer fragmentation on the one hand and increasing material interdependence between concrete labors opens the possibility for another universalism, one that is based on concrete specificity. So I conclude by saying that urban studies is very, very well suited to develop this critique, because the forms of labor organization that have started to develop in this current phase of capital accumulation are territorially rooted, are no longer circumscribed to spaces of production, as it happened in previous stages of capitalist development, where the factory was the place that, the pivot of labor organization. Now, social struggles tend to be articulated around territory, right? Around the neighborhood, around the city, around the extraction site, around the geographies of extraction in the case of the mining industry in Chile. Okay, so thank you very much. That's